following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
The graph is clearly seeing massive adoption market share. It's clearly positioned in a space, and it's not just resting and sitting back, it's taking initiatives and building out.
GRTiQ podcast.
We are like astronauts, floating in the space of time.
Welcome to the GRTiQ podcast. Today I'm speaking with Denham Preen, co-founder at Float Capital, a peer-to-peer asset protocol that provides leveraged returns without over-collateralization or liquidations. Float has recently garnered a lot of attention within the graph ecosystem due to the launch of something the team is calling Subgraph Uncrashable, a framework that generates helper functions in your GraphQL schema that makes common subgraph bugs impossible. During this interview, Denham and I talk about his entry into crypto, the impressive Web3 community emerging in South Africa and throughout the entire continent, the origins of Float and how it works, Subgraph Uncrashable, and the ways in which Float uses the graph. As always, we start the discussion talking about Denham's educational background.
So first off, I'm from Cape Town, South Africa. So I did my undergrad at a small university called Rhodes, Economics and Computer Science as my undergrad. And then I did my postgrad in computer science as kind of my focus. And that was at the University of Cape Town, or UCT.
Denham, that's interesting, right? Because for most listeners, and certainly for me, those seem like divergent fields of study, computer science and econ. Do these fields relate to each other more than maybe meets the eye?
Yeah, great question. I think one of the beauties of computer science or studying that kind of field is it's not really specific to a certain domain. By that, I mean it kind of applied to kind of any kind of industry or interest that you have. And I think with economics, there's definitely a lot of applications where kind of the two overlap. And I think in the kind of crypto world, you get tokenomics, and there's definitely kind of a lot of interplay between this field of economics and computer science. So I would say that they are maybe divergent to the unseen eye, but in terms of there being an overlap, especially in the crypto world with kind of tokenomics. And I still spoke about this at one of the conferences called ETH Safari in Kenya. And, just dived into some of the more basics around token economics and how they kind of interlink.
One thing I've been asking guests of the podcast when they join me and say that they have a background in studying computer science, I like to ask if during their studies at any time did they learn about crypto, did they learn about Bitcoin or any of these Web3 blockchain type of themes? And I ask this question just because I think it's fun to get a sense with people all across the world studying the same topic, if there's any emergent trends at the university level where people are exploring and talking about these themes. So is it true for you?
Yeah, superb question. So I graduated maybe 5 or probably a little bit more years ago. And at that time, we kind of were introduced to it, distributed ledger systems, kind of part of the big ABCD of like big tech, AI, big data, cloud computing, and then distributed ledgers. So we definitely touched on it. But funny enough, my core diving into the blockchain space, at least at the university level, didn't know it at the time, but my two founders, they worked on what kind of in hindsight was maybe just quite early. So it was quite kind of simple into diving into distributed ledger technologies and kind of these comparisons between centralized systems and decentralized and distributed systems. And so I read their kind of paper, and that was maybe my most kind of academic jump into blockchain from an academic perspective, studying computer science.
Well, Denham, as you mentioned in your introduction there, you're joining me from South Africa. I've had the opportunity to interview other guests that have joined me from South Africa, but I always enjoy getting a sense from guests of the podcast what the attitudes and opinions of the people where they live are towards crypto and Web3. So what can you share about what's going on in South Africa as it relates to Web3 and blockchain?
Totally. Great question. There's multiple facets why Web3 is applicable to South Africa and the greater Africa. So I did listen to your prior podcast with Ken Fourie, a friend of mine from GraphQL. And I think, if we kind of dive into the different sectors of it, one being, there's great tech talent within Africa. And, usually African countries are at a different standing point in a greater macroeconomic view. And this makes the talent super high quality at more affordable rates for different companies. So there's a lot of great tech talent within South Africa and Africa. And I think if we look at it in terms of some of its applications, unfortunately, within Africa and third world countries, we quite often see quite a bit of corruption. And I think innately with this definition of corruption, it's kind of linked to this inability to have, transparency and trust. And it just makes the system very, very useful. This transparency that becomes the paradigm of blockchain and, all these different pieces that fit together that are really well positioned to solve African context problems. The other one I just want to touch on within kind of the African landscape, I know, again, touching on going to East Safari last year, I was based in Kenya. Maybe need to be fact checked on this, but someone kind of mentioned that Africa was one of the biggest transactors or volume transactors of USDC. And this is quite prevalent in remittance, these kind of cross-border payments. And usually these remittance kind of middle parties lay on massive fees. And naturally, crypto is this really global system. It's not tied to, a specific location, and therefore make transacting is a lot cheaper. And it allows people to get around these exorbitant remittance fees, just transferring money across countries. A lot of, African people will work in one country to, send money back home. That is kind of this definition of remittance. And there it's been super prevalent. It's super applicable, solving real world problems right now. Yeah, just a really great application.
I appreciate you mentioning Kent. And as you said there, I had the opportunity to interview Kent Fourie for episode 62. Encourage listeners to go back and listen to that if they missed that one. Kent's a brilliant guy with a real hands-on approach to how Web3 and blockchain could impact South Africa and the world. Denham, I want to ask you this follow-up question. And again, a little bit of a standard question I ask on the podcast, which is one thing that I've learned by hosting this podcast is developing parts of the world seem to me to be adopting crypto at a greater pace than more developed parts of the world. And you essentially said that there. But I want to just kind of flip the script here and ask you, do you see or perceive that in places like the United States, the interest in crypto being more of a speculative nature versus where you are at home and there's a real utility driving interest?
Yeah, sure. Deep question. And I'm not sure I know the perfect answer for it. But I will say, the underlying technology is absolutely incredible. And because it's absolutely incredible and it's simple and it's beautiful, we get quite a lot of, fluff on top of it. And this fluff might be the difference between speculation and, fundamental or book value. I.e., your book value is X and your speculation value or what kind of gets priced in is considerably higher because they're trying to price in this future value that it might be. So yes, I think what you're saying kind of makes logical sense. I'm sure there's definitely still, heavy speculation in developing countries, but it is possibly quite likely, however, beyond just providing value to third world countries. And I think the adoption happens maybe a bit quicker because, the problems are more prevalent or there's greater pain points. And because it's a greater pain point, this adoption comes in a bit quicker and there's less challenges or blockers or, just pure lack of regulation or issues to try develop these things further that it might make it easier to adopt or faster to adopt in kind of developing countries.
So then I'd be interested to know then, based on the fact you studied econ, you studied computer science, what it was that happened or the journey you took to decide, hey, I'm going to go work full time and pursue a career in crypto.
Yeah. So to kind of unpack my career and up until this point, or let's say before I got into kind of the crypto sphere, I was always quite passionate about startups and, read Peter Thiel's 0 to 1 and was quite hot and kind of keeping up to date with different things. And, I'd like to pursue this kind of potentially more riskier career path of, the startup. It's quite exciting. It's quite adventurous. There's a lot to unpack in it. And this brought me to working with a few different startups. Maybe my first job was as a developer in a startup, and then grew some skills, and then kind of moved into a consulting space, working with a couple of different startups again. To be honest, they're quite like across multiple different domains, med tech, property tech, just really kind of unpacking it. And I think the driver there was more the kind of startup world. And then where for me, I started to progress a little bit further is after kind of this consulting phase, I started working for a VC, that's a venture capitalist or private equity, kind of the same realm of investing in companies. And what I would do is I'd kind of perform their due diligence from a tech perspective. So I'd have to sit there and write these very kind of objective reports on their portfolio companies or potential portfolio companies and dissect their technical stack. And I say an objective view because you can have quite strong opinions in the tech world. So I'd have to come in and say, cool, this landing website is built in XYZ. It's a up and coming strong tech, and some of the assets are loading really slowly. So, this is potential areas of improvement or XYZ. And it kind of went down to things such as, helping in hiring and really just kind of working with a lot of different startups in that kind of field. And that was my kind of preceding startup career focus, and learned a lot of different case studies, which was really fantastic. And then how I got into crypto was through a hackathon. So my two co-founders I studied with as well in computer science, and we are close friends. We went into different fields. One went into kind of machine learning side. The one went straight into the blockchain career. And we joined to do ETH Cape Town, a really fun, really awesome hackathon. We flew in from overseas. We were kind of working in different jurisdictions at the time and took part in this hackathon. And we developed this project called Wildcards, and we were fortunate enough to be one of the winners of the hackathon. And this kind of was the intro to kind of, learned so much of this hackathon, so much value adding that we really dived into it further. We took our product and launched it live. It was a project focused on endangered animal conservation. It was really awesome, aligned closely with me, especially coming from South Africa. And yeah, that was initial stepping stone. And then from there, got into the Ubisoft incubator in Paris. So we moved up to Paris to carry on, and then got into another incubator in Switzerland. And that was with Crypto Valley Venture Capitalist, CVVC. And really awesome path, learned so much. It's quite great. So they obviously kind of invest in you, and then just more than providing you with capital, they foster you and develop you further. And just got some awesome talks from different people in the crypto industry, and the opportunity to kind of learn more. That was pretty much my path into crypto, very much from a tech-driven perspective. Very passionate about, the building and what the blockchain paradigm can provide.
If we go back in time, when did you first become aware of crypto? And I got to imagine it was probably in those days when you were working in a startup environment.
I think my initial introduction to crypto was pretty early on. I happened to meet a guy in Thailand covered in tattoos that was raving about Bitcoin and how this thing was going to be the future. And I don't know, in hindsight, it would have been great to kick my past self in the butt and say, listen a bit closer. But he didn't seem too much of an idol. And I don't know if I took him too seriously, but he's probably laughing right now at the amount of Bitcoin he told me he was holding. And maybe that was my first introduction, and I was a little bit skeptical. I didn't fully understand the technology. And I think it's healthy to be skeptical. I think there's, especially in the space where the technology is so clever, there's a lot of like fluff on top of it where people kind of dive in and things. And you really should look at things for their like true value. Anyway, going off on a tangent. But I was a little bit skeptical. I was like, okay, cool. This is my kind of first introduction. And then I think this is maybe even like early on in my undergrad. So I wasn't too deep in the tech world. I came back and I continued my studies. And then, there was a little bit of like kind of talk around, and I was like, cool, this is kind of interesting technology. Maybe I should dig a little bit deeper. So I did a little bit of self-studying, a little bit like, cool, let me see this and that and read a bit further and, understand the difference in, like a transactional blockchains such as Bitcoin, and then this like virtual machine blockchain, which is like Ethereum. It's a computing system, and it just lured me in bit by bit, and it became more and more interesting. And I think it was by my kind of postgrad with my two other co-founders where I kind of, naturally chatting to them was more interested. And then still, I think it was more from my side, dabbling in just a little bit, putting a little bit of my savings in it, exploring it a bit, but not taking it too deeply. And then I think when we built quite a bit on top of it, that's when I was like, wow, okay, this is going to change the world.
Denham, this is not an uncommon theme to hear on the podcast, someone starting or first impression of crypto being somewhat of skepticism, but then eventually it switches into conviction for the space. How would you explain to somebody who might still be in that skepticism phase of their journey and don't quite understand or realize what you know now? What was it for you that was a light bulb moment that switched you from skeptic to someone with conviction?
Yeah, I suppose it was really understanding it and looking at it from a personal perspective. So I think what a lot of people, or a lot of the input I was receiving was from, and keep in mind, studying economics and having a bit of a finance background and then going into computer science. I would say I was fairly, maybe expert's a bit of a strong word, but I was better versed in this field and I should have kind of known more. And the people that were maybe introducing it to me were less known. So I was a little bit like, okay, is this just a soundboard that you've heard from someone else and it's all kind of bouncing around? What was my maybe more realization was this, or like this conversion of being a skeptic to, a hardcore Web3 maxi, is this deep understanding and looking at it and being like, okay, cool. So you can do this, you can do that, and realizing, oh my goodness, this changes the entire fundamentals. So this changes this. And I think for me, it was taking the time in a personal capacity to explore it, try and understand it, look at a few different things. I think you can look at a meme token and be a bit baffled and not fully understand it and just look away. But truly, there is some resounding technology. It's absolutely knocking things out the park. And it's because of this that, there's this, things happening in the ecosystem, which might not be as face value valuable. But yeah, it really is a sound technology.
The GRTiQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, dApps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTiQ, and thank you for listening. Listeners who enjoy this content can help support the GRTiQ podcast by leaving a review or a 5-star rating wherever they download podcasts, by sharing episodes on social media, or by simply telling a friend or colleague about something they heard or learned from one of our guests. It's support from listeners like you that make it possible for us to keep shining a light on the people and stories behind Web3 and the graph.
Roger that.
Well, Denham, the reason why we're speaking today is because you are one of the founders of Float, and there's been a lot of pickup on Twitter and other places about some of the tools that you and your team have contributed to the graph ecosystem. I want to talk more about that, but before we do, what can you tell listeners about Float and its origins?
Yeah, exciting. Keen to unpack the world of venturing into the graph and the problem solution case it was really solving for us. But to tell you a little bit about Float and its origins and kind of where we came from, I've touched on it a little bit with my two co-founders. We met at university, went into kind of different tech fields, joining in for this hackathon. We're fortunate to win this hackathon, and kind of we took our project a little bit further. And with our prize money, we knew there was another one coming up in India, India, and we thought, sick, let's use our prize money to get a flight. So we booked a flight there, carried on bouncing around these different hackathons. And then this took us to X, Y, Z. And slowly but surely, we just got more and more ingrained in the blockchain space. ended up doing some consulting. My two co-founders are fantastic. They're really awesome, both computer science backgrounds as well, quite a strong kind of tech background. I think the entire team at Float is quite a strong tech background. It's really something we focus on. And this kind of venture and journey together brought us to culminated with Float. So Float was not our core product at the time, and we were doing some consulting work. We did some stuff with Safe, or known as Safe previously, a couple other kind of names. And Float was kind of the culmination of our skill sets coming into a platform. And Float is a tokenized derivatives platform where you can get leverage and you can trade different asset classes. And it kind of came up from our exploration into these different DeFi protocols. I would say Float exists in the DeFi space, and looking at it and trying to analyze it. And I think blockchain, first off, is kind of the future of finance, let alone decentralized finance, purely because of its kind of operation. And this journey kind of unpacked bits by bits, and it culminated in Float.
I keep saying this to you, but there are themes that continually emerge on the podcast when I speak with different guests. And one of them is this hackathon experience, meaning somebody has an idea, they work super hard on it, they win, and then they just kind of reinvest that winning into a plane ticket to the next hackathon. I've seen it here before, and here you are describing a very similar process. What was your experience working in that hackathon, and how important do you think these hackathons are for the industry?
Hackathons are absolutely awesome. They are an incredible way of pulling developers into the ecosystem, letting developers tinker, let them play. And obviously there's a bit of a shortage of developers in the industry, or like the greater scheme of the demand for developers is maybe greater than the supply. And it's a really cool way of just drawing developers into the space. Again, tinkering with different systems, different technologies. There's awesome workshops at hackathons. This is where I was first introduced to kind of the mechanics of DAI and, how it kind of operated as a stable coin. And, you tinker with this, you tinker with that. And from a developer's perspective, it's super fun and exciting. There's big prizes up for grabs. And, they make it quite accessible to build different things. And there's a lot of support and facilitation. We've done so many hackathons, loved it so much. I think we've maybe felt, I think we've moved into more of a kind of mentoring at hackathons position now, way. Because I think, hackathons are intended to bring developers in, tinker with technologies and stuff like that. And it's a bit unfair, at least from my perspective, if we, try to just do a bit of a money grab. So from what we're working with now, we enjoy hackathons from a more of a mentorship perspective, but it's been truly awesome, and they make it really accessible to get prizes. There's also like just smaller prizes up for grabs as you implement technologies and stuff like that. But we've been fortunate enough to take part in ETH Cape Town, ETH Berlin, ETH India, as I mentioned before, ETH Turin, mostly kind of the Ethereum ecosystem was where we dabbled. We took part as Float team in the Avalanche Summit last year, the hackathon hosted by Code Club. Truly awesome, really fun. We split up into 3 teams. We're again fortunate enough to win in a few different domains. There's actually a YouTube video of our experience. Quite fun if anyone wants to dive into that. I'm sure if you just search Avalanche Summit Float team, you'll find it. But yeah, truly fun. Hackathons are incredible.
I'll put a link to that YouTube video in the show notes. So any listener that wants to watch that video, please visit the show notes. So let's unpack Float a little bit here. And you'll have to forgive me. I'm not the sharpest guy when it comes to DeFi, but can you break down a little bit how Float works?
Absolutely. So we like to say Float is the easiest way to get leveraged long or short exposure to different asset classes. And essentially through kind of these smart contract mechanics, we pair these long and short traders. And in our V1, the kind of natural progression question is, what happens if the long pool is not equal to the short pool, or there's not as much long positions to short positions? And we solved that with something called floating exposure. So the exposure or the leverage would fluctuate within a band, And with our V2, which is what we're currently working on, GRTiQ, we've implemented a novel mechanism which essentially has a third pool. And this third pool is for market makers and it ensures kind of constant exposure or leverage. Some of the other cool kind of outcomes from having this peer-to-peer system is that we don't have liquidations. And that's not to say there's no risk in using the platform, but it's pretty awesome that there's no risk of liquidation. And if you are a trader in the DeFi space, you've probably been liquidated at some point. But with our system, we don't use collateralized debt positions. And this means there isn't a need to maintain a margin. And so you aren't at risk of liquidation, which is a pretty cool and kind of novel outcome of what's seemingly quite simple.
Well, that's a great overview and makes a lot of sense of what you're building there. When it comes to use cases or your ideal user, who did you have in mind or what use case did you envision for Float?
So Float is built for traders. That is DeFi users with financial sophistication who want to open leverage positions, who have kind of a well understanding of both DeFi and kind of the finance side and are comfortable with handling their risk. But it's built for users who want to go long or short in any asset class. So at the moment, we've stuck with a few different asset classes, but what's really cool is as long as, our fantastic friends at Chainlink can provide us with a price feed, we can provide that asset to trade on the platform. And historically, we've focused on crypto assets, so allowing for kind of leveraged ETH or Bitcoin positions. We had a really cool market called the flippening, which allowed you to trade on ETH's market cap in comparison to Bitcoin's market cap. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the term the flippening, but this is kind of a play on Bitcoin and Ethereum, which is the one that's going to kind of pass each other, which is very well contested. But yeah, if you want to learn more, check out our docs. Hop over to float.capital. There's links to the Discord. Feel free to answer any questions. Teams in there on a daily basis. We use it as our kind of internal messaging platform, really to stick one-to-one with our users.
I am familiar with the terminology flippening, and I'm sure a lot of listeners are, but for a little bit of context here, there's a debate within crypto about whether Ethereum will one day flip Bitcoin as, the largest token or project in the space. I want to get your opinion on that, Denham. So where do you come in on that? And like you said, it's well contested, so I highly doubt you and I will solve this today, but do you have an opinion on the flippening, if it'll happen, when it'll happen, these types of things?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think people like to unpack the flippening from different perspectives or contexts. So some say the flippening is actually based on transaction volume or, number of transactions. And then some maxis will take one side or the other. But I think where kind of my potentially biased viewpoint comes in, and I'm not a maxi on either side, I see value in both. Maybe looks at it and says, okay, well, Ethereum, we look at the market cap and the Ethereum market cap is considerably less than the Bitcoin market cap. However, if you look at the ecosystem or the value that's built on top of Ethereum, I might say that Ethereum has already flipped Bitcoin. That's my kind of light view without diving into it too deep and, throwing strong opinions around. But from that side, I think maybe, Ethereum, if you look at its complete value of the ecosystem, has surpassed Bitcoin.
Well, it's timely you bring that up because I recall reading in the last 6 months, I think there was almost $800 million of transactions completed on Ethereum. And that is by far a market leader in the space. And it's remarkable. So to your point, maybe the flippening has already occurred, but an interesting debate for sure. And only time will tell. I do want to ask you about the Float team. You've mentioned your two co-founders a couple of times, but what else can you share with listeners about the team at Float?
So we've been pretty focused on finding the absolute wrinkliest brains out there. We are super stoked to be working alongside each other. We have pretty flat structure. We work with cool people that, we have a little kind of proxy test and something like, would you be happy to hang out them in a waiting room at the airport? Would you get along? So we all get along pretty fantastically. The team is gigabrains, smart as can be. And personally, I enjoy hanging out with them. We have some good banter. We go on quite a few workaways, lots of cold swims and solving hard technical problems together aren't always linked to, what exactly we're working on, but just, enjoying the math problems and playing some chess. Yeah, it's a really cool team, and we focus on working on problems we feel passionate about, but we should take enjoyment from. Life's too short to really not enjoy the work you do or the peers you work alongside. And yeah, truly awesome team to be working with.
For listeners who want to learn more about Float, what's the best way for them to dig in and see what's going on over there?
First off, I highly recommend just going to the platform, playing around a bit, making a trade on the testnet. You can go to testnet.float.capital. No real money, just playing around. That's on Mumbai, the Polygon testnet. And other than that, float.capital is the site. You can head over to our docs. That's docs.float.capital. If you join our Discord, there's a lot of links to our Discord throughout the site. We have a nice little kind of technical primer or intro to where to get started, jump into XYZ. Part of it, we're always online to answer questions. And yeah, lots of different places to find out more about Float.
Well, as I said before, I'll put those links in the show notes. So again, if any listener wants to learn more about Float, please visit the show notes and you'll find links to everything that Denham just mentioned there. When we were preparing for this interview, Denham, I asked you a lot of questions just to get a sense of all the things that you and the team are working on there. And you mentioned something that I wanted to ask you while we were recording, which is you have some conviction for blockchain or DeFi being the future of finance. And I'd just love to get your take here for listeners. Why do you have that conviction?
Great question. So blockchain, in my view, is the future of finance. Blockchain is a very applicable system for a lot of different use cases. So I think what helps in kind of unpacking this is drawing it down or coming back a little bit and saying, what actually is blockchain? And for someone that's maybe not technical, someone that's not familiar with the blockchain space, a blockchain can be viewed as kind of a database. It's viewed as somewhere where you can store information. And because of this decentralized structure of a blockchain, i.e., you're not reliant on a single point of failure to manage this database, it creates this kind of different paradigm, and it becomes a better system for managing data that needs to be extremely reliable. And when I say extremely reliable, I mean like, let's say finance, transactions. You send money from A to B. You need that to be accurate and reliable and stored securely. Now, blockchain is super fantastic for applying to this use case. It does introduce some, other concepts to think about in different paradigms, as I said before, such as, transparency. All the information is public, anyone can see, although maybe not so much of the progressions in ZK tech, which is quite cool and exciting. But it's simply a better system for managing finance. And just to unpack a little bit more, if we take a look at two different, the historical way of, like accounting, company A and company B. Company A, sends money to company B, and this goes from one bank to another. And on both of their journal entries, the one has money coming off and the other one has money coming on. Now, naturally, if there's a kind of accounting clerical error, there'll be a disparity. And, it's like, okay, well, fine, whatever it is. I think there's like a leeway of something like 5% or something. But anyway, there's this disparity, and that percentage over like a grander scheme is quite significantly high. Whereas blockchain uses a single ledger system, i.e., company A and company B are using the same database to manage these transactions. And this means that there's no possibility of there being a clerical error. There's a single ledger. And this is truly so beautifully simple, and it's so applicable to kind of the use case of finance. That percentage, although could be small, at the value of what's being transacted, it is kind of a significant amount of value that's just being purely lost. It just disappears into the ethers, for a little pun. Hi, this is Denham Preen with Float Capital. If my conversation with GRTiQ podcast has been helpful to you, then please consider supporting future episodes by becoming a subscriber. Visit grtiq.com/podcast for more information. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
GRTiQ
Podcast.
Thanks for listening.
Roger that.
So Denham, as I mentioned at the outset, we're talking today because of some of the cool things that Float is doing with relationship to the graph. Before I ask you about those very specific solutions you've been working on, do you recall when you first became aware of the graph and what some of your thoughts were about the protocol and the problem it was trying to solve?
Yeah, absolutely. So we were introduced to the graph pretty early on. It maybe wasn't as big as it is now, and obviously a monolith in the space, providing an absolutely incredible service. It's clearly found product market fit. We were introduced to the graph back at the end of 2019, and I think it was a little bit more clunky back then. I remember sitting with my co-founder in Switzerland and going through a little bit, and the error messages might not have been so helpful as they are now. And it's a different language to dissect if you're not familiar with assembly script. But we committed with it. The graph team was super helpful. It really paid off for us in terms of being a technology we could use. And this problem it's solving of capturing or indexing data from the blockchain in a customizable fashion is incredibly useful for building, kind of backends for your data application. And another kind of key point, real time. And what I'm kind of emphasizing is a lot of data or indexing systems, they capture data from the blockchain, but they are staggered. So they take snapshots. I don't know, I won't pick any names out, but essentially they're taking data from the blockchain, which is slightly lagged. So any kind of real-time application, Float, where you perform a transaction to open a position, you need to see that position open when you mint it. And the graph provides this real-time data for kind of indexing this data from the blockchain. And this is really useful for any kind of user-facing app where it needs to be real-time. People are transacting. And yeah, I'm super glad to have kind of explored and taken this journey from initial, developer experience. It's obviously come a long way since then. Been an awesome adventure.
So does Float then use the graph?
So at Float, we do use the graph. It's important in our UI for users transacting. And beyond that, we've built kind of additional parts into our subgraph to assist us in, alerting to identifying anomalies within our kind of smart contracts, or just to track that and, make sure we've got our finger on the pulse in terms of any kind of security issues. It's been fantastic in getting data, analyzing number of users and metrics that we use to identify, like what are features that are quite useful, how many users are using stop losses, that data is initially captured in the subgraph for us to kind of analyze and take further. And yeah, it's been truly kind of essential for our tech stack. It's kind of a critical piece of infrastructure. I think the graph setup on using an RPC or trying to fetch data directly from the chain is, if you look at it in hindsight, it's kind of funny. You really couldn't aggregate like historical data. You can look at something at a point in time, but you can't, amalgamate it all together. And this kind of service offering from the graph is really fantastic.
Well, as I've mentioned a couple times, Denham, we're talking today because of a problem and a solution that the team at Float worked on with respects to the graph and subgraphs. I remember when I first became aware of what you were doing, it was on Twitter, and there was this tweet about uncrashable subgraphs that was making the rounds throughout the community. And I dug a little deeper. I saw that it ended up on the Graphs docs page. And so I knew we were dealing with something really important and valuable for the community. For anyone that isn't familiar with this, how would you explain what uncrashable subgraphs is and the story of how it came about?
Yes, absolutely. So it entirely comes from a self-need basis. We built it for ourselves. We actually have built kind of a few different additions on top of subgraphs for our own personal use case. And I think that's, a great driver to value. It's, we are the users of our own product. And so we built this tool internally for ourselves. And quite fortunately, through a graph grant, we were able to open this up and generalize it so that any kind of subgraph uses technology in their subgraph to ensure uptime. But just to give you the TLDR, the Subgraph Uncrashable project is a tool that's built into the Subgraph CLI, which allows for it generates helper functions for your subgraph that make it very, very difficult for your subgraph to crash. And what I mean by this is when you have a subgraph in production, if you have an unaccounted edge case, and I can unpack one of those, your graph can experience downtime. And this is because, you missed something. And so what the Subgraph Uncrashable framework allows for is to capture this potential downtime and rather alert you of this kind of edge case in your system, because usually 99% of the time, it's linked to a single edge case that was from a single user that was really unaccounted for. It was not something that you could have easily predicted. You can write all the tests you want, but you just simply didn't account for the scenario. And I can unpack a simple scenario, which makes it a bit easier, but it essentially ensures uptime. And we initially built this before subgraph grafting kind of appeared. And that's obviously helps out quite a lot now. And if you're not familiar with subgraph grafting, just check it out in the docs. But for you to deploy a subgraph, there's a ton of data to index. And for it to sync and catch up, and essentially you deploy a subgraph at a point in time in the past based on the block number, and it'll index all this data, and it's called syncing. So as this catches up, if you have a production system that's been in live for a year or so, it takes quite a while. And this can be in the order of a couple of days for your subgraph to catch up. And so we really wanted to prevent graph from going down, i.e. kind of continuous uptime. And we've done this through the Subgraph Uncrashable framework, which is just these help functions which you can use to ensure that you can't make, maybe common errors. There's something called a race condition where you load an entity, you call another function, you save it, and then it kind of picks up on the one saved before the other, and your entity or data point kind of disappears. And this is quite, should I say, possible to do. And our framework kind of ensures everything is completely atomic so that you don't have kind of issues loading and saving. And there is a bit of a nuance to kind of understanding it. And we've got some great docs in it, and it is in the graph documentation as well, with kind of detailed installation instructions. Quite straightforward. You can install it with a flag when you kind of initializing your subgraph. But yeah, super helpful, really great tool for trying to ensure that your graph has continuous uptime. And that's a super valuable feature for, just to come back a little bit to the graph grafting feature. Now, if you do experience an issue, you can make changes, developers can fix the solution and then sync the graph or that code from a point in time, which is more recent. So it doesn't take an order of days anymore to catch up, but still very useful. Your developers aren't getting alerted in the middle of the night saying, hey, system's down. We need to quickly debug and solve this error to get it back up for other users. And usually, as I said, 99% of the time, it is very fully accounted for, and it's just this 1% that's not, or this one user has done something completely unexpected that's caused downtime or a bit of panic for everyone.
That's an incredible overview, and I'm sure a lot of listeners will be excited about what you've done there, and I'll put links to the docs in the show notes. I want to ask you a question about subgraphs, and I think I've asked it before on the podcast, but I'd love to get your opinion on it. And it's this idea that by virtue of what the graph has done and the impact subgraphs are having in the Web3 space, and maybe in this particular case within the DeFi and what Float is doing, I wonder if you think about it in terms of a format war, if subgraphs have kind of won that. Are they the winner of the format war in Web3, meaning that they are the default format by which people will always query data from blockchains? What do you think about that?
For sure. I mean, the graph is clearly seeing massive adoption, market share. It's clearly positioned in a space, and it's not just resting and sitting back. It's taking initiatives and building out, improvements and additional ways and approaches of indexing data, with, substreams, teams, etc. It is so well positioned in the industry. It is a critical piece of infrastructure. It's clearly seen adoption. I think one of the just simple ways of proving that adoption is it exists in different boilerplate projects. And when I say boilerplate projects, this is something that like someone at a hackathon will grab and download and use to develop their DApp or idea. And, the subgraph is baked into these applications as like a pre-formatted boilerplate that users can use to build on top. And so it's very ingrained in the ecosystem. It's definitely well positioned. It's taken the kind of decentralized route, something that's maybe is not quite as important as the, smart contract side of things, but obviously the data about that's really important for it to be decentralized as well. And so you're not just falling into this. I mean, the word DApp itself, decentralized app, is a bit of a oxymoron or something that's not quite always true. The smart contracts are very much decentralized. Now we've got this decentralized data layer as well, which is fantastic. And often the website's kind of just centrally hosted, but we have been seeing kind of a progression to taking these apps to decentralized apps, DApps, with kind of Arweave hosting and stuff like that.
Can I ask you a follow-up question about that? In the range of how important decentralization is, you mentioned earlier in one of your remarks that there are other solutions that people can use if they want to go find or get data off blockchain. But one thing that sets the graph apart is that it is a decentralized network. How important is that to you? And what's your estimation of how important it is to other users that the graph is decentralized?
It is so critically needed. I think in the longer term and the ethos of blockchain, having decentralized data infrastructure on top of the underlying smart contracts and these backend systems is critically important to the ethos of the space. Now, it's quite a challenge to fully decentralize systems and data, especially kind of a play on the blockchain trilemma or decentralized trilemma of large data and stuff like that. So the graph has done really well in creating the system and integrating the GRT token into its play of ensuring that this data is decentralized, but it allows for kind of users to reliably, or more so developers reliably, know that this data is kind of true and not manipulated or centralized. I think that's what I'm trying to get to, the difference between decentralized and centralized. An example of a centralized backend is someone that's kind of built ground up custom solution, probably quite buggy, quite challenging to build out. Misses data points, misses blocks.
Well, Denham, now we've reached a point in the podcast where I'm going to ask you the GRTiQ 10. These are a lot of fun, and listeners really enjoy hearing different guests answer the GRTiQ 10. There are 10 questions I ask each guest of the podcast every week, and I do it in hopes that listeners will learn something new, try something different, or achieve more in their own lives. So are you ready for the GRTiQ 10?
Yeah, hit me.
The GRTiQ 10.
This is the way.
10 questions for astronauts floating in space.
This is the way.
What book or article has had the most impact on your life?
I could dive into a couple of different philosophy books, but I'm going to say both out years. I think in terms of impact, as cheesy as this sounds, I think I have to go with Steve Jobs' biography. Not because it's going to change your life, but as I read it when I was much younger, it had some radically different views, but at least kind of broke the mold. And it resonated with me, which was a catalyst to me thinking differently. And Steve broke a lot of kind of legacy industry and was a very impactful book for me personally.
Is there a movie or a TV show that you would recommend everybody should watch?
I would go with Ready Player One. I think it is a fantastic movie to watch, especially with the growing metaverse, especially particular time now. Or I would potentially also include The Matrix, of course. It's got multiple facets to it, but again, another kind of interesting case study on a utopian future of the metaverse.
If you could only listen to one music album for the rest of your life, which one would you choose?
So this one, I think I'm going to go with a bit more of a personal one. And I'm going to go with The World of Birds. It is a band which my brother is in. And I think if I could only ever listen to one more music album, I would have to go with my brother.
How about this? What's the best advice someone's ever given to you?
So advice I haven't followed myself, but it was to learn on someone else's money until you're 30.
What's one thing you've learned in your life that you don't think most other people have learned or know quite yet?
I would go with you don't get up if your seat is too comfortable.
What's the best life hack you've discovered for yourself?
bit of a cop-out, but I'm going to go with a pen and paper notepad. I have an ever-expanding to-do list, and that's perfectly okay. I've come to terms with the fact that I'm never going to get to all of it. It's just a great kind of place to jot down ideas, makes context switching easier. You can just pin things down, just good old pen and paper. And, a lot of the things on the to-do list can be completely arbitrary or a bit kind of out of the box and not specific to what I'm focused on right now. But a lot of it's also just, taking shots on goal and taking as many shots on goal as you can, ticking off these items and being okay with missing, but really focusing on kind of keep taking those shots.
Based on your own life experiences and observations, what is the one habit or characteristic, Denham, that you think best explains people finding success in life?
Success in life. It poses a good question to what defines success. But I would maybe go against the grain on some kind of things that people might come across. But I would say, don't break what's not broken. And I'm going to give it a little example, and this is maybe a bit close to me or someone I'm thinking of specifically, and we chatted about this. But if you're someone who wakes up at 10 a.m. but is massively productive, then don't listen to the 5 a.m. club that tells you otherwise. Don't break what's not broken.
And then the final 3 questions are complete the sentence type questions. So the first one is, the thing that most excites me about Web3 is?
The same reason that it is unfortunately sometimes shrouded in fluff, or there's scams and, this extra stuff that doesn't really support the ecosystem. But it's because the technology is so simply elegant and this completely new paradigm. It's breaking so many molds. It's really taking complete concepts forward in a way that couldn't be thought of or could never get adopted before. And there are such fantastic, massively many of these little micro experiments that have these kind of slight tweaks on different governance models and how you can collaboratively come to conclusions on systems. And I think what's so cool about these different governance experiments, and I call them experiments, but a lot of them are in production functioning really well, but they essentially govern themselves. So these systems are essentially saying, okay, cool, well, this kind of voting system isn't working optimally for us. Let's have a vote and decide if we can tweak it to a slightly different system. And it just changes the way you think of society. And it's truly unreal. It's absolutely awesome. Another book maybe I can throw out there quickly is Glenn Wild's Radical Economics. Also a really awesome book. Unpacks a bit of governance. These concepts are something that couldn't be brought to light, but through the blockchain and this system, it's quite simple to get into production and, iterate and experiment from there.
Great answer. And how about this one? Complete this sentence. If you're on Twitter, then you should be following
float_shipping. Nah, I'm kidding. Should be following GRTiQ. Nah, okay. My true answer is going to be our CMO at Float. That's Campbell Easton. 11 out of 10 banter and some hot news on current crypto affairs. He is fantastic. And beyond Twitter, also let's go with Lens. Lens is obviously super cool. And his handle in there, I think, is Donk Bronco.
And the last question, happiest when?
Connecting with friends and family. Social connections was the standout takeaway on the secret to happiness. This is from a TED talk, actually, which is on the longest social study. It's something like 80 years. Don't quote me on that. But it was essentially dissecting this massive group from 2 different backgrounds over 80 years. And the takeaway on the secret to happiness was having better family and social connections.
The GRTiQ 10.
After this, I show you how deep the
Podcast.
Denham Preen, thank you so much for taking the time and being so gracious in your answers. An incredible explanation of the team at Float and the problems that you're working on, as well as how you've incorporated the graph and even contributed to the ecosystem by building some important solutions for developers and those working in the graph community. If listeners want to learn more about you and follow things you're working on, what's the best way to do it?
First off, a massive thank you for having me. It's been an awesome chat and very fun. Really excited about the graph, the ecosystem where it's progressing, been super helpful in our journey. And from even pre-float and this general blockchain and crypto progression of my personal career, as well as kind of the team and my co-founders. For any news, you want to follow along, keep up to date on what's happening, you can check out float_shipping. That's our Twitter. Our Discord is in multiple places, but easiest is just go to float.capital and kind of follow the links there. And of course, just try out the app, play around. There's testnet.float.capital on Mumbai, which you can play around with. And my personal Twitter is Denham Preen. That is DenhamPreen.
This has been a production of the GRTiQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing,